Okay, so we're going to talk about the Pantheon, which is part of the High Empire under Hadrian. And the Pantheon was started after Hadrian took power, or maybe even slightly before. It is one of the best preserved buildings from ancient Rome and is one of the most influential buildings as well. Hadrian didn't take credit for the building. He actually dedicated it to Marcus Agrippa, who had built an earlier Pantheon on this same site. Of course, by this time it was in ruins, and so Hadrian actually built a new one. And we don't know who the architect was, but whoever it was really used concrete to its full potential and really revolutionized how architecture approached interior spaces. So this is the front of the Pantheon, 125 CE, looking south. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 Corinthian columns in the front. This big obelisk, which is a shape borrowed from Egypt. So here we can see a restored cutaway of the Pantheon. So originally you could approach the Pantheon from a columned courtyard. That's no longer there, I don't believe, but you can see part of that courtyard here. And at the narrow end of the enclosure stood the Pantheon, and it had 8 Corinthian columns facing the interior of the courtyard. And in antiquity, the ground level of the courtyard was actually much lower than the structure, and so the structure would have kind of been up a bit from the ground level. Today, I believe this is pretty much filled in, but in antiquity, you would have been quite a bit lower. So we'll look at the interior of the Pantheon. Rome, Italy, completed 125 CE. So behind the columned porch, there was a huge hemispherical dome, and the dome is about 142 feet in diameter and 142 feet high. So it's a perfect sphere, basically. The dome is based on the intersection of 2 circles, and at its construction, it was definitely the largest dome that was ever built up to this point in time. And the dome was built up in sections. So sections as in, vertical, horizontal sections probably that stacked on top of each other. And basically the lower section was made with a concrete that had a sturdier, heavier stone on it. And then they used a lighter stone, such as pumice, in the concrete as it moved up. So the concrete is actually heavier towards the bottom and lighter as you go up, just because they changed the materials in the concrete, using pumice in the concrete at the top. Because pumice is a volcanic, very aerated stone, and it's very lightweight. And also the dome's thickness decreases as it nears the apex of the dome, or the oculus up here. The oculus, lets in light. And the oculus is about 30 feet in diameter, and the use of coffers, which are sunken relief panels, actually lessened the weight of the dome as well. So these are just ways of reducing weight, but they don't compromise the strength of the dome either, but it is a way of removing material from the dome to make it lighter. And it was thought that each one of the coffers had a golden rosette in the middle to kind of further symbolize heaven. And they're gone now. And so, so the interior space can be imagined as the sphere of the earth. So this actual interior space, just the air itself, the shape of that is in the shape of an orb. So it could be seen to symbolize the orb of earth. And then the dome itself, made out of concrete, could symbolize the heavens. And the oculus is at the top, which lets in light and creates kind of a high drama in the piece. You can see where the sun is shining, and there's actually where the light comes in, there's a circle there. And that moves around throughout the day when the sun is moving in the sky. So it kind of creates drama in the space. And the original marble survived, which is really incredible. So the marble facing on the floor, on the walls, the columns, along this area, all of that Typically in a Roman building, we only see the structure beneath the column or beneath the marble, but in this piece we actually see, and that's why it's in such good condition, because it still has all the original marble, or most of the original marble survives. So it really gives us an idea of what the interior of great Roman buildings looked like back in the day. And so one thing about this space, before, concrete, pre-Roman interior spaces were limited because they needed to take into consideration the walls of the structure that actually supported the structure. So they were thinking about walls more than they were the space. Whereas with concrete, Roman architects were able to conceive the architecture in terms of units of space that could be shaped by enclosures. So they're really thinking about the interior space instead of just the structure itself because of concrete. And so the Pantheon's interior is a single unified self-sufficient whole, uninterrupted by supporting solids, and is capped by a dome with the oculus, which the visitor sees through the drifting clouds and the sky and the sun and the realm of the gods. So there's kind of a lot of symbolism in this piece as well. Pretty neat piece, and it really is a huge influence in architecture moving forward. So we'll look at Hadrian's villa. Canopus and Serapeum. Looking south, Hadrian's villa, Tevoli, Italy. So Hadrian was actually an amateur architect, and one of his projects was his villa in Tevoli. And this is basically a pool and kind of an artificial cave called a grotto. The artificial cave is down at the other end in this picture. And grottos were, featured in gardens in antiquity and today. And some were natural caves, but this one is actually artificial. And the name of the the structure actually comes from Canopus, which is an Egyptian city connected to Alexandria by a canal. So that's kind of where the name kind of comes from. But the most famous temple in this Egyptian city of Canopus is dedicated to the god Serapis. So that is kind of where Canopus and Serapeum, the name of this place, comes from Egypt, but it doesn't feature anything Egyptian in its design, only in the name. So the grotto, or the fake cave at the end of the pool, is made of concrete, and it's kind of a pumpkin-shaped feature. And it was probably designed by Hadrian himself, because he was an amateur architect, and Hadrian really loved Greek art, and there are many copies of Greek statuary present in this space. You can see here some different copies, and there's actually some caryatids, copies of the Erechtheion columns from the Athenian Acropolis. These are copies of the caryatids that were featured on the Erechtheion. And the columns at the end of the pool are Corinthian. You can see the acanthus leaves. And the columns kind of frame in the pool here. As you can see, they kind of serve as a frame. There's no real supporting structure that they seem to be supporting at all. They're just framing it in. But they're actually topped with these unusual arcuated or arch-shaped lintels. So there's a straight lintel here, and then there is an arch-shaped lintel. And these could be considered posts, I guess, but they're columns, obviously. But this is an arch-shaped lintel, which is really a unique idea. We haven't seen that in Greek art. We haven't seen it too many places other than here. And so it kind of is, this is just an example of how Romans really loved Greek art, but were not afraid to invent new things and use new ideas, such as an arch-shaped lintel, and break the rules of classical Greek architecture and art. And this is especially typical of High and Late Empire Roman art. So, okay, we'll keep moving forward. This is the treasury in Petra, Jordan, 2nd century CE. And this is a great example of how Roman architects used Greek architectural elements in a purely ornamental fashion, but with complete disregard for the Greek classical rules. So it's called the treasury. It's one of the more elaborate temples found cut into the rock face. And the facade of this temple is 130 feet high, and it features 2 stories, so you can see that there. And the columns are evenly spaced, which would not happen in Greece, obviously. The columns would have been mathematically spaced out perfectly. And the pediment only covers the 4 interior columns, which is unusual. Usually, in Greek art, this would have spanned the whole width, the pediment would have. But obviously this is Roman art. They break the rules, right? So, and then there's this kind of Tholos temple on top, a round temple, resembles the Greek Tholos. And there's definitely a dynamic play of light and shadow here, with the sun and the deep recesses that have been carved into the rock. And the design really recalls some of the architectural fantasies that were painted on the walls of Roman houses, such as like we found at Pompeii. And so this really does look like a Greek painting from Pompeii, wall painting, in that there's just a lot of architectural fantasy type things going on, and frames with columns and then motifs on the interior. So something to note there. So we'll talk about Ostia next. So around 90% of Rome's population actually lived in apartment blocks that were multi-story, and they were called insulae. And these were typically made of concrete faced with bricks. And it was actually expensive to live in these apartments, and to live in Rome, which is a lot like today. I mean, larger cities, if you want to live there, it's very expensive. And it was like that in Rome back in ancient times. And Ostia was actually Rome's harbor city and was booming with trade. And it was the site of extensive building projects during Trajan and Hadrian's time in the 2nd century. And it yielded many temples, theaters, public baths, warehouses, and then the apartment houses as well that we'll be talking about. And, Ostia had many things that Rome had during the 2nd century. They were both fairly large cities that featured a lot of different building types. So here's a model of an insula from Ostia, Italy, 2nd century CE. And the most common buildings were these multi-story insulae. And typically shops would be on the ground floor, and then on the upper floors there would be apartment complexes. And then many of the apartments were actually pretty nice. Some of them were nicer than others. Some would be covered with frescoes and also could feature vaulted ceilings, much like the one shown here. You can see the fresco and the vaulted ceiling here. Insulae only had narrow light wells or small courtyards, so they were much darker than the typical private Roman house. Also, there were typically a larger number of windows that faced the city's noisy streets. So typically these apartments could be quite loud if they had a lot of windows that faced the street. And then many residents cooked their food in the hallway. There wasn't a kitchen typically. And typically many residents shared a latrine or toilet, often on a different floor from their apartment. And we can definitely say that these insulae were more like modern day apartment complexes than any other ancient building type. And another interesting thing to note is that the exterior was always brick. They never put stucco over the brick. They never put marble over it. The architect actually wanted to use the brick as a material in and of itself, which is typically not something that was done before this time. And if they wanted to add something extra to the exterior, they would add in like some 8-gauge columns with marble on top of the brick in certain areas, or they would use contrasting colors of brick. So they'd use 2 different colors of brick and then add on elaborate moldings. So in the 2nd century, this is a time period when, let me go back here. Brick really came into its own as a building material and was actually quite respected. So you can see there's some contrasting colors of brick. They've actually added in some kind of pedimental type moldings here, some arches, different shapes with contrasting colors of brick, just to add in, and then some engaged columns here in certain areas to add a little bit of panaz, a little bit of decoration to the exterior, but really they're using the brick as a material in and of itself. So I will continue on in the next video.